Welcome to Psychology of Women. Sorry that we have to start off the semester with a video lecture instead of being able to do this in person, but, well, no. So what we're going to do online today is go through the course requirements, and I'll walk you through Blackboard, and then we will do Lecture 1. So let's start with the syllabus. As you can see on the syllabus, you have all the course information. I'm pretty sure you know what room it's in, but it's all up there, as well as my email address and my office hours and my office location. Now, my office hours are open door. You don't need to have an appointment. You can just walk right in. You'll also need the textbook for the course, as well as 2 green Scantron forms that you can find in the bookstore. Now, when it comes to the book, if you would like, you can buy it new from the bookstore with the access code to the McGraw-Hill Connect website. We'll talk more about this in a minute. So, class attendance, I do expect you to participate in class, not just be a passive learner. Please be an active learner, ask questions. I encourage discussions, debates. I think that it can be very important, especially in a class like this. I also ask you not to have your cell phone on if you are, say, on call or you're a parent. I get if you have to have it on vibrate in your pocket, but try not to pull it out and use it during class time unless necessary. I do encourage you to talk to me beforehand and let me know, hey, I'm on call, that if I pull out my phone, that's why. And that will make it a little bit better than me just thinking you're pulling out your phone and checking your text messages all through class. You're allowed to bring your computer, tablet, whatever you'd like, if that makes it easier for you to follow along with lectures, but I do expect you to be on course material while you're in class. If you are sick or have family emergencies, contact me as soon as possible. It's only important if you're missing an exam. We'll talk about attendance shortly, but basically I don't have excused absences from class. Now, if you're going to end up with an extended absence, then we might need documentation and to get you back on track. But if you're going to miss an exam, please let me know. We can do a take early option if you know ahead of time. That way you're not having to worry about a makeup. As far as making up the exams, you can only make them up with a documented excuse accepted by ODU. That would be things like hospitalization, some sort of contagious illness, and you'll have doctor's documentation for either of those, a death in your immediate family, military service, work. I generally will work around too because I know many of you also work full-time jobs. So let me know and we'll see what we can work out. As far as assignments, I will accept them up to 1 week past their due date. It will have a 10% deduction in credit. So if the assignment was worth 25 points, you will automatically lose 2.5 points. After 1 week, the assignments will not be accepted for any reason. There will be mini tests administered through Blackboard throughout the semester. You'll have a week to complete them. Therefore, I don't accept them late. It is possible, of course, that you could have some sort of technical difficulties, your internet drops while you're taking the test. Let me know immediately so that I can reset the test for you. Student athletes have to be more responsible. You're expected to keep up with your coursework as well as your athletics. If you have some sort of travel schedule that you need some accommodations for, please let me know. You're supposed to provide me with documentation of athletic status during the first week. Obviously, this is not going to be easy to do since we're not meeting in person. Your book is available at the bookstore, and you're welcome to go ahead and buy it brand new there. I understand that sometimes you need to get a lower cost alternative, maybe rent it or buy it used. The course website will not be used for required credit but extra credit assignments, so you may be okay with getting the used. And there's the honor code. Now here we get to our grade requirements. As I mentioned before, you'll have mini tests online. There's 2 throughout the semester. Since we just have a midterm and a final, these mini tests are to check in between to make sure that you're keeping up with your reading, as well as making sure that you're understanding the material. They can also be useful for studying for the larger exams when it comes time to do that. They will be matching, labeling. I have essay on there. I likely won't do a full essay, but maybe some sort of short answer. It does come from both your textbook as well as lectures, so you're expected to be keeping up with the readings as well. Most of psychology is applied, so just being able to memorize definitions will not always be enough when it comes to taking a test. You will possibly have to actually apply it to real life. You can see the dates here for the different mini tests. They will be available for a week. Their due date, as you see, mini test is due. One is due on 2/13. It will be at 11:59 p.m. Your exams will be a midterm and a final exam worth 100 points each. The midterm will be on 3/13 and cover chapters 1 through 7. And the final will cover chapters 1 through 13. It is cumulative and will be during the class's finals time slot. You will be expected to bring in a Scantron and a number 2 pencil to take the exam. If you arrive late, you will not be allowed extra time. If you need to leave the room during the exam, you will need to ask permission. So the next thing we're going to talk about is your social identity project, and this is your big project for the course. It is a multi-part project that you will bring together at the end for a final paper. You can see it's broken down into sections, and each section is worth a different number of points and have different due dates. The first part we'll actually do in class. The second part will be a little research. I'm going to call it an essay, not exactly a paper. And it will be looking at social influences on gender identity. And so you'll be looking at research about this social influences, as well as looking at 3 examples from your own life with music, and 3 examples of other social factors on how they influenced your own gender identity. The third part will be research and summarizing 2 theories of gender identity development using APA formatting for this section, as well as in-text citations. The fourth part will be looking at your same-gendered parent. Now, if you do not have a same-gendered parent that you can interview, for whatever reason, someone who is the same gender from the same generation as your parents would be appropriate. Somebody who's had an influence on your life, so it could be an aunt, uncle. If you really need to go back a generation, you could do a grandparent as well, as long as they were some sort of influence on your life. Then you have your final project, is where you take all those pieces and put them together to organize the final paper. You will also need to have a classmate or peer grade your final paper using the same rubric I will be using to grade it. And you will submit their completed rubric with your final paper. You're welcome to make changes to your paper based on their suggestions. It doesn't have to be the exact same paper that they graded, but I want to see that you're actually getting someone to look over your work before turning it in. Now there's a Word document full of all of the detailed instructions for this paper. It talks about your role, who your audience is, who you should be directing the paper to, and in the format, as well as the general tasks. It also has a diagram explaining how this is all coming together visually. And finally, there is a checklist. So as you're going to put together your final paper, the paper checklist is a really good way of helping to make sure you structure your paper appropriately and that you're not missing anything that you'll be graded on. So your introduction paragraph talking about the purpose and discussing the topic broadly. And then your second paragraph should be about your own gender identity. The third paragraph about your parent interview. And again, it could be multiple paragraphs for this section since there's a lot of information. All the questions you should answer for that. Then your social influences, toy influences, gender theories overall, gender theory application, and finally a conclusion paragraph. There's also a separate document for the interview to help guide you through your interview paper. It talks about how you don't need an abstract, how many pages, some sample questions for the interview. You can add other questions, but these are tied into what I'm expecting to see in that final paper. And also a general format of how you should be writing the paper. This is all going to be available on Blackboard, and I'll show you Blackboard in just a minute. I don't have the rubric ready yet for the final paper, but I will be working on that and getting that up in the next couple of weeks. The next graded piece is your class participation. There will be a sign-in sheet that goes around, but we'll also have class activities. Just because you sign the sign-in sheet does not mean you will get full credit for class participation. If we have a class activity and you do not complete it, your name is not on a paper that gets turned in, you will not receive full credit. Each class that you attend and participate in, you'll get 2 points for a total of actually 26 points if you attend all of the classes. We may have guest speakers if it can be arranged. And so if there's material presented from a guest speaker, that can and will be on exams. And then your extra credit options. These Learn Smart activities are through the McGraw-Hill Connect website that goes along with your textbook. And if you buy the textbook new, it will have the access code. If you buy your textbook used, you can go back and buy access just to the site and for a lower cost. I believe it also has the e-text. I'll have to check into that. But you can avoid the cost of a hard copy altogether if you wanted to do that. And this is the link to get to our class on Connect. The other option is to attend some sort of event on campus that you can relate back to psychology, not just our class, but psychology in general, and you write a paper about it. Here's the points breakdown. All the parts of the project come up to 76 points, and then your final paper is 100 points. You can see your exams, tests, class participation. I do a total point system. So whatever you earn will be divided by 500, and that will give you your final grade. And our extra credit gets added into the total points you've earned in class. So say you do option 2, you get those 10 extra credit points, you earn 450, that will take you up to 460 to be divided by 500. And the last page is our schedule. And you can see all of the assignments being due there on the right-hand side of the page, helping you to keep track of everything. Now I'd like to go over to Blackboard now. I use Blackboard extensively, partly because I think students find it useful. You can see our teaching staff, my information is there. The syllabus has a link right there in case you lose your copy, you can get another one, as well as a quick link to the schedule so you can check in at where you need to be each given week. PowerPoints will be posted up here. I have the first 3 already posted and ready. Your assignments are the different little pieces of the big project. So that overview that I showed you, the checklist, as well as a listing of all of the different pieces. Now this one will be completed in class, so it doesn't require the use of Blackboard. But when you're ready to do part 2 of the project and turn it in, you can actually turn it in here on Blackboard by clicking on part 2 and browse my computer. Just like uploading an attachment to an email, you find your file. Be certain you click submit. If you click save draft, it does not turn it in to me. Only saves it on Blackboard for you to see. So submit, and then your part will be turned in. All of the links are there, ready to turn things in. Here's your parent interview, the document that I showed you with all of the instructions. As I said, the rubric is not available yet for the final paper, but it will be posted soon. Then your mini tests, they are not up here yet, but the broad instructions as well as dates, and you'll see the mini tests available under this link. Your extra credit has its links over here too. McGraw-Hill is the link that you're taking. Now, the activities through the Connect website are put here in this folder. You can see the first 7 are due by the midterm, and the last are due by the final exam. We're testing on that. And all of them are already posted. You can quickly see their due dates. This link will take you directly to it once you have your account set up. So you can start the assignment as soon as you're ready. Tools, if you're not familiar, you can go and find your grades. And I keep the grade book updated pretty regularly so that you always know what your grade is in the class. You also can send emails through Blackboard, so you could send it to everybody in the class. Maybe you miss a class and wanted to ask someone for notes, or just select the particular users that you want to communicate with. So this is our broad overview of what course requirements are. You see the syllabus, you see Blackboard. And now I want to find out what your questions are about what you're expected to do in class. Now we will move into our first lecture. So our first chapter is really just a broad introduction to the psychology of women. So why do we even bother to study the psychology of women? What makes it important? Why does it get its own class, its own field? Well, first of all, it's interesting. A lot of you are taking this class simply because you were interested and you wanted to know what makes the psychology of women different than, say, the psychology of men. Overall, just to help us understand women better, to correct any sort of biases that you find in many traditional psychological theories. One of the biggest, of course, most people know, psychoanalytic theory, the theory first developed by Freud, is considered to be quite sexist against women. To also look at qualitative differences between the male and female experience. Maybe we can't quantify it with numbers, but there is a qualitative difference. And to improve communication among women. Now, there's a lot of paradox in the study of psychology of women. There's a lot of tension between, say, gender differences and gender similarities. There's different fields of even feminism that emphasizes differences versus similarities. And a lot of times the research is always focused on finding the differences. But a lot of improvement between the genders and improvement in sex biases is to understand how similar we actually find men and women being. So I take us now into our sex, gender, sexism, and feminism. So first, using these terms sex or gender. A lot of times they're used interchangeably. Sex, for example, can mean male or female, but people also use it to talk about sexual intercourse. So the term is fairly ambiguous. And gender is the state of being male or female. So when we look at sex in this class, look at it in terms of biology. If you have XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes, what parts do you have between your legs? That is sex. That is the biological piece. Whereas gender is a lot more about who you are in your mind. How do you see yourself? Masculinity, femininity, as well as the cultural meanings that are attached to being masculine or feminine. And then sexuality is about sexual attraction. Sexism is whenever someone has experienced discrimination or bias based on their gender. It's also called sex bias. Generally speaking, as we go throughout this course, we will be talking about sexism directed at women. But I do like to try to bring it up throughout the lectures that there is sexism directed at men. For example, how many of you would be willing to hire a male to act as a nanny to your children? Many people are against this idea because they don't think men are as nurturing or as compassionate. Or that even men only want to be around little children because they want to, we'll say, take advantage of them. So this is an example of how men often experience sexism. There's also a difference between the old-fashioned sexism and the more modern sexism. Now, our old-fashioned sexism was more overt, it was more open, it was more hostile prejudice against women. Women can't do this because they're too weak, they're too emotional. Women need to be protected, they're fragile. Whereas our modern sexism, also known as neo-sexism, tends to be a little bit more covert or subtle types of prejudice beliefs about women. It's not as expressed as overtly and as obviously. Now, sexism is very common, and when they surveyed age 12 to 18-year-old girls and women, they found that 23% stated they were discouraged in math, science, or computers by teachers just because they were females. And 32% said they were discouraged by other students who were male. 28% reported being discouraged in athletics by their teachers and coaches, and 54% said they were discouraged by male peers. So you can see that it's actually pretty common to experience sexism still today, even though many people want to say that the sexes are equal and that there isn't a lot of sexism. So our hostile sexism is a negative or hostile attitude. It tends to be more adversarial. So this hostile sexism is based on the idea that women are trying to control men through their sexuality or through feminism, and that feminists hate men and they're trying to control and change men. Whereas benevolent sexism tends to be about trying to put a woman on a proverbial pedestal. It's more of the idea that women are fragile and women need to be protected. Benevolent sexism is pretty rampant even among women. If you were getting mugged as a female and a male was with you, would you expect the male to get between you and the gun and protect you? That's benevolent sexism. And do you expect men to pull out the chair for you or open a door for you if you're a woman? Should men have to pay the check when a male and a female go on a date? These are examples of benevolent sexism. It's about protecting and taking care of women. But it's still based on the idea that women need protection, that women can't take care of themselves. Now, a feminist is a person who is looking for equality between men and women. Typically, this is based on politics, economy, and social equality. And so they're looking for legal and social changes to try to achieve this equality. But there's a wide spectrum of feminist beliefs. Would you identify as a feminist? So first we have our liberal feminism. And liberal feminism is about trying to change the laws, the customs, as well as overall social values to create equality between men and women. So liberal feminists are looking for law changes. So they're going to work mostly with the government to try to create this change. Radical feminism says that men just control and dominate women, and it's about oppression. This is a lot of the research on violence against women and girls tends to be based on this more radical feminist idea. Radical feminists often advocate for separatism, that women are better off in women-centered communities and that they'll be safer, more protected, as well as to have more equality, to have all of their rights, and to be able to achieve their full self. Womenism, also known as women of color feminism, does not go along with this idea of separatism. Women of color feminism often looks beyond just gender, but also looking at color and how, based on your race, that you may experience much more discrimination and prejudice than a white woman would, but also look at the experiences of men of color. Women of color feminism also has been taken to be more broad in terms of sexual orientation as well as gender identity. It's a more strengths-based perspective, so looking at all of the good qualities that you have because, say, you are a woman, or say because you are African American. And so you can see it goes for inequality, not just about gender, but also race and ethnicity. Other things could include sexual orientation, social class, as well as ability or disability status. Then we have our cultural feminism, which is actually emphasizing the differences. So women are more nurturing or more compassionate. If you believe this, then you foster equality between the sexes by promoting this as a valuable characteristic that women have. And looking at gender differences can be an important thing too, and looking at how they have this to offer society and this to offer each other based on being a different gender. It does look at the historical devaluing of girls and women, looking at how their contributions haven't been recognized. We've seen this, there's a movie that just came out looking at 3 women who were African American and how they were able to help in the technological field. You look at how these have been missing from the history books, for example, and looking at what they've had to offer to society over time. Global feminism looks at feminism not just within the country or the nation that you're in, but how it can be a global social movement. That in other cultures, we see that prejudice and discrimination can be very different that women experience. That in some cultures they experience a great deal more, or in others they may experience less, and how culture plays a role in prejudice and discrimination, as well as how neocolonialism and global capitalism has created this system of oppression for women in other countries. So our history of feminism in our country, the first wave began in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Mostly it was focused on legal inequalities, specifically trying to gain the right to vote for women or suffrage. The second wave of feminism was in the 1960s to the 1980s. There was more focus on cultural inequalities, looking at how gender norms pressed women to have to act in a certain way and that they weren't allowed as much control within relationships, and how women did not have equal rights within society. You can see pictured there Gloria Steinem and Dorothy Pittman Hughes, 2 really major workers in the feminist movement in the 60s and 80s into the 80s. You sometimes hear it called the women's lib movement. Is also looking for things like legal abortion and really push that Roe versus Wade verdict to allow the safe legal abortions for women. This wave of feminism was flawed. For many of the women going through this movement, it was very separate based on race. There was a white women's feminist movement and an African American women feminist movement, and they were not joined together because often the white or Caucasian women did not recognize the intense inequalities that the African American women experienced based simply on their race, that they had even fewer rights and they experienced more discrimination than white women, and they didn't have that support from the white women to help to improve their inequalities that they had experienced simply based on race. Now, our third wave of feminism began in the 1990s and continues on today. It is a response to that second wave, trying to correct its perceived failures. As you can see the picture in the middle of this, we all can do it, is focused more on cross-cultural equality, looking at racial equality. It's incorporated many more men into the movement, as well as looking at how women are treated based on being perceived as sex objects, as well as women's rights to be able to dress the way that they want and not be perceived as asking for a sexual assault. For example, you've maybe heard of the slut walk, which is a women's protest against being basically pigeonholed and stereotyped based on how they're dressed. So our last thing we're really going to be looking at is psychological research and how sex bias has factored into affecting the results of our different research across the many decades of this, and how it's factored into how we perceive women. So we need to gain skills to be a good consumer of psychological research, to be able to look for the biases in the research that we're reading, so we can recognize when it was not really a good study to base your theories on or to base treatment on. So you need to know how the psychologists go about doing this research. If you understand the process, understand where the bias can come in, you're more likely to be able to recognize sex bias in research, and also be more aware of how research on gender roles can be biased in looking at the study of women. So these are the different steps in doing psychological research. First, you have the theoretical model that gets created, the theory. So the research starts with a theory, then you create a question based on this theory and design the experiment based on your question. So you're going to choose certain behaviors, how to measure it, choose the design of the study, the participants, then you'll collect the data, analyze it, interpret it, and then publish those results. Each step of this model can have bias enter into it. So we start with the theoretical model, and this is going to have a pretty profound effect on the outcome, because certain theories are already biased against women, which will create an entirely biased study. I've already mentioned the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic orientation tends to have the belief that women have an immature superego, for example. Now, this immature superego means that women are not capable of having a strong moral compass. That's what it means. Your superego is your morals. And so women are weak in the moral area. Now, if you are creating a study based on this theory, you may be looking for the presence of an immature superego in women. And if you had a different theoretical orientation, you wouldn't even think to ask such questions. So this creates a very biased model from the start. The questions you ask, like I said, start with that theory. You may create biased questions, but certain questions being asked and certain others being ignored can create bias, because then we're not having the studies on the questions that also need to be asked. There's a lot of stereotypes about women and men, and this influences the kinds of questions that have been investigated. Feminist scholars advocate going into the community of people being studied and asking them about their lives and what the important questions actually are. So one of the basics of feminist research is a lot of times looking more at qualitative versus quantitative data. Going beyond numbers that don't tell you the whole picture, looking more at deeper in detail research that's more qualitative in nature. The psychological tests we use can actually be biased themselves. If you're looking to measure characteristics like aggressiveness or intelligence, you've probably heard there's intelligence tests. There's also aggressiveness scales. One test that has been shown in some research to be biased is the SAT. In 2004, men's average score was 537 on the math section, but women's average was 501. So we gotta wonder, are women actually poorer at math, or is the test biased? Now, one of the things we find is that women tend to have higher scores in math in their classroom, higher grades in high school math classes, but they score lower on the SAT. So this could really point to the test itself being biased. One of the sample questions from the math scale on the SAT was, a high school basketball team has won 40% of its first 15 games. Beginning with the 16th game, how many games in a row does the team now have to win in order to have a 55% winning record? Here, males have an advantage because they tend to be more experienced with team sports and computing win-loss records. And again, yes, that's a generalization. Many women watch sports as well, but not as many often as men. And so that past experience could give them a bias that would allow them to be more likely to get this question right than women. Males tend to be more often used as participants in research, so this can lead to an overgeneralization. If we have a sample that's 75% male and 25% female, we take these results and we generalize them to the entire population. But that's only looking at a very small percentage of females compared to males, and that can create a big research error. One of the things in research is that there's been a lot of protections in place to try to protect women, specifically because women can get pregnant, and the researchers looking at any sort of medications don't want the accident of hurting a developing embryo or fetus because the woman becomes pregnant during the study. And that's just one reason why women have often been limited in research as participants. But whenever you conduct research on specifically men, you can't then also overgeneralize it and say that it applies to women just as equally. We found that there are certain medications that don't work the same in men and women. For example, certain medical conditions as well. Heart attack looks different in women than it does in men. Heart medications work differently on women than men, but because most of the research had been done on men, they were putting women on the same heart drugs. And this overgeneralizing actually can have very serious health consequences for women because it doesn't work the same way. There's a Health Equity Act for Women done in 1990 that mandated women must be included in clinical research trials to try to prevent this bias in choice of your sample, creating a much more representative sample. Certain research designs can also have bias in them. Laboratory experiments are the type of study where participants' behavior is manipulated in some way, done in a lab setting. Naturalistic observations are when you watch someone in their natural setting, hopefully without any interference at all or without their awareness they're being watched. Quasi-experimental designs are using two or more groups, but they are not randomly assigned or they are not manipulated. For example, a lot of research is called experimental, but you're looking at gender differences. Well, when your two groups are males and females, you're not manipulating gender. It just exists. So they're not an actual experimental design. It would fall under quasi-experimental designs. In experiments, there's something called experimenter effects. This is where something about the experimenter will affect how the participant behaves and ultimately affecting the research outcome. When you have, say, an experimenter who is female, men are more likely to report more sexual partners. Belief about rape myth acceptance differs significantly depending on the experimenter's clothing, whether they're dressed more conservatively or provocatively. So who's asking the questions can actually affect how people respond. One way to reduce experimenter effects is to have many different experimenters asking the questions and making sure that half of them are male and half are female. If it's about style of dress, you could change that. Other characteristics need to be accounted for as well in the experimenter effects. Also, researchers can have observer effects when they're observing how people are behaving, say in a naturalistic observation. The observer themselves may be biased or may pay attention to certain things more than others, creating these observer effects, especially if they are looking for stereotyped behaviors. So that stereotyped expectation can shape what they see, what they pay attention to in the participant's behavior. Bias can also affect the interpretations of data. So one thing we find often is that certain interpretations are based on this female deficit model. So, for example, males estimate that they will get higher scores than females estimate they will get. if you go to give an entire group of people a math test, for example, and you ask the males, estimate how well you think you'll do on this math test. You ask the females, estimate how well you'll do on this math test. Women consistently underestimate their abilities. So how do you interpret this? Are females insecure that they're underestimating their ability, or are males overconfident, overestimating their ability? Often they look at it through this female deficit model and look at the deficiencies in the females and use that as their interpretation. And then when it comes to publishing your results, most researchers do not publish insignificant results. So when you're looking at their outcomes, did I find a significant difference? No, I didn't. Well, then I'm not going to even bother publishing it. So usually the research that we see out there is much more emphasized on gender differences than on gender similarities. When we don't find a significant difference, then it doesn't get published. We don't see the results that are saying women and men are the same. And so we have a lot more emphasis in the field of psychology on all of the differences between men and women instead of looking at how all the ways that they are the same. Some other biases. Female scientists are often considered less authoritative, so this can lead to different experimental effects in the study. Scientists also tend to remember and use only the studies that are consistent with their own ideas. So when they're looking for the basics of their study, or even when they're publishing their results, or when they're making their observations, they're going to be biased. Male, female, all scientists tend to be a little bit more biased in their interpretation and what they look for. So our feminist alternative is looking for more gender-fair research to try to reduce or even completely remove gender bias. Avoid single-gender research. Never study just men or just women. Choosing theoretical models that have gender fairness, that are not already biased against one gender or the other. Using both male and female researchers to reduce experimenter effects. Being careful when you interpret your data that's in a way that's looking for gender fairness, or at least postulating several different possible interpretations that are not just focused on, say, the female deficit model. Other innovative methods could be focusing, like I said already, more on this qualitative versus quantitative, moving away from just numbers and statistics, but analyzing text or open-ended interviews. There's different text measurement alternatives where you're looking for certain themes, or integrating both together, so you're not just reducing people to numbers, but looking for more in-depth information. So are we making progress? Are women becoming more equal to men in society, or specifically here in psychology? In 1965 to 1974, you look at the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, 68% of the participants were male. By 1995, that number had declined to 49%. So we're getting a more equivalent amount of females into the research. And then looking at 12% of the articles in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology had a female first author from 1965 to 74. By 1995, we've gotten that number up to 30%. So we're getting an increased number of female first authors, female lead researchers in the field of psychology. So looking ahead, where do we go from here? Well, a lot of the history has focused on being male as being the norm. So anything when we're looking at humans, however the male acts, that's the norm, and females are seen as a deviation from the norm. You can see this in the biblical creation study. Adam came first, Eve was created from him. We often use masculine pronouns as a default. So if you have no idea of what the gender of the person is that you're speaking about, a lot of people default to the he pronoun or him. We see a lot of androcentrism. Our society tends to be male-centered, that men are the norm and women are to be compared against this norm. And so this leads us to really need to change our language need to change these different themes in our stories. Historically, there's been a belief that women are evil, that women are the source of evil or immorality in the world. You see in the Judeo-Christian story of Adam and Eve, Eve is responsible for original sin. Ancient Greeks, Pandora was responsible for releasing all the evil into the world. In Chinese mythology, yin is the female force, which is the darker evil side of nature. Early Puritan America, you see the witch burnings, the Inquisition also focused on women. More often women were targeted as being the evil ones in those situations. In modern science, we're trying to look more for the similarities instead of focusing on just women and men being different. And most of the research actually supports this. Women and men are more similar than they are different. Focusing more on empirical evidence and getting away from just theories. Looking for traits versus situational determinants of behavior. Actually, this is the switch. Looking more at the different external factors that create these differences. That internally, say empathy, for example. Men and women actually have equal levels of empathy in a lot of research. But situational determinants will push men to act less empathic or females to act more empathic than men. And to try to look at this as trying to see how those traits are actually similar, and it's a situation that is often affecting our social pressures, causing us to act in a certain way that we have learned to think that society expects us to, that because we're a woman we have to act this way, because we're a man we have to act this way. Also removing these female deficit models and trying to get rid of those. And looking at values in a scientific understanding of women and how women's values or social values affect male and female behavior. That's all I have for our first chapter. It's really just supposed to be a foundation and a broad overview of where we're going to go for the rest of the semester. Now, I'd like you to really think through what we just studied and tell me what questions you have about what we have been looking at.